The dining room at Whitmore House held 27 people, 5 courses, and one very large opinion that had not been invited. It belonged to Quentin Westbrook, Duke of Westbrook, and it expressed itself, as opinions belonging to dukes of his particular variety invariably do, at precisely the moment when the table had gone quiet to refill their glasses, when the candles had that particular quality of stillness that candles acquire just before a draught arrives, and when everyone present had momentarily run out of things to say about the unusually warm March. He leaned back in his chair. He looked down the table. He said quite pleasantly, "Miss Merriweather, shouldn't you be thinking about cooking rather than trading?" A silence fell, the kind that arrives after something both rude and amusing has been said, and no one has yet decided which aspect to acknowledge first. 3 of the gentlemen laughed, a hesitant sound that meant, "I am not entirely certain this was clever, but the Duke seems confident, which is usually enough." Beatrix Merriweather had been in the middle of explaining the current disruption in the eastern spice routes to Lord Whitmore, who had asked, sincerely, with genuine curiosity, for her opinion. She set down her fork, not hurriedly, not with emphasis, with the particular deliberateness of a woman who had been told since the age of 11 that the most effective response to an insult was to give the appearance of not having recognized it as one. Then she looked at him. He had hazel eyes, she noted, the kind that caught the candlelight and held it, flecked with green and amber, which was the sort of visual detail that had no bearing whatsoever on the matter at hand. He was 32 or thereabouts. He had the posture of a man who had been instructed to stand correctly so many times during childhood that the habit had fused to his spine. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who expects his joke to land, because it always has before, which was, she thought, rather the problem. "I could, Your Grace," she said pleasantly, "though I find the returns on trading rather more satisfying than those on a roast." The table laughed, less comfortably this time. He looked at her. Something shifted, small, quick, behind those hazel eyes. Then he looked away and said something to the gentleman on his left, and the conversation moved on the way conversations at dinner parties always do, when they have brushed up against something that wants more room than the occasion permits. She picked up her fork. Lord Whitmore, who was 70 and had been in trade himself before inheriting the title, gave her a look of considerable respect. The Duke did not say another word directly to her for the remainder of the evening. She noticed, in Regency London, where a woman's worth is measured in the elegance of her curtsy and the accuracy of her marmalade and the particular grace with which she declines a second glass of port, Beatrix Merriweather has learned to do her own measuring in something considerably more precise: profit margins. When the Duke of Westbrook dismisses her as a dinner-table curiosity in March, neither of them suspects they are already 3 moves into a game that will last until the leaves turn amber, because by October one of them will be standing on the other's doorstep with hat in hand, and it will not be Beatrix. A story about pride, intelligence, and the peculiar satisfaction of being underestimated by exactly the right person. The carriage ride home from Whitmore House took 40 minutes. Beatrix spent the first 10 watching gas lamps slide past the window, and the remaining 30 doing mental calculations that had nothing to do with the Duke and everything to do with the quarterly figures she was expecting from her Derbyshire broker in the morning. This was a habit she had developed at 11 years old, when her father, Gerald Merriweather, had first set a ledger in front of her at the breakfast table and said, "Tell me what's wrong with this page, B," and gone to refill his coffee. She had found 7 errors by the time he came back. He had stood behind her shoulder reading her corrections, then set a book called A Practical Treatise on the Wool Trade beside her plate as a reward, which was not the usual sort of gift that fathers give daughters, but Gerald Merriweather had never been the usual sort of man. He had been a merchant, the making something from nothing variety, which is the most interesting kind. 30 years of careful attention and patient compounding, a small firm grown into a well-regarded one, a reputation built name by name and return by return, and then, with the sort of timing that death always seems to manage when it wants to be maximally inconvenient, he had died in January and left her the whole of it. The firm was Merriweather and Sons, which was what it had always been called, and she had not changed the name for the sensible reason that London in 1815 was not quite ready to direct its commercial trust toward a firm called Merriweather and Daughter. She managed the accounts and the client correspondence under the name B. Merriweather, which was accurate in every detail that mattered and ambiguous in one that did not. In the 6 months since her father's death, she had increased the quarterly returns by 11%, which she allowed herself to find thoroughly satisfying in the small hours of the morning and was careful not to mention at dinner parties. The carriage stopped. She stepped down into the cold of Conduit Street, thanked the driver by name, and let herself in through the front door. "Good morning, sir," said Newton from the parlour. "It is 11 o'clock at night," said Beatrix. Newton considered this with the measured composure of a creature who had seen humans get the time wrong before and would see it happen again. He was perched on his brass stand in the corner of the parlour, a medium-large African grey parrot with the grey round head of a philosopher and the vivid red tail of a creature who had decided that subtlety was optional from the waist down. A pale yellow patch of bare skin encircled each of his very bright, very small eyes, giving him the permanent expression of a man who has just been told something surprising and is taking his time deciding how to receive it. He had belonged to her father. He was 23 years old. He would, in all probability, outlive her, which she found equal parts comforting and absurd. A small grey monument to everything Gerald Merriweather had considered worth knowing, still announcing it to empty rooms. "Buy low," he said with conviction. "That is excellent general advice," Beatrix agreed, setting her reticule on the side table and pulling off her gloves. She sat in the chair nearest him, the one that was worn on the right armrest from years of her father sitting in exactly the same position. The parlour smelled of beeswax and old paper, and faintly of the almond biscuits Newton had demolished around 8:30. She looked at him for a moment. "The Duke of Westbrook suggested tonight that I ought to be thinking about cooking rather than trading." Newton made a sound. It was not precisely a whistle and not precisely a laugh, and was entirely, irreducibly Newton. "Quite," said Beatrix. "He has hazel eyes and excellent posture, and not the faintest idea what is happening to nutmeg prices in the eastern routes, which is his prerogative, I suppose. Dukes are not required to know things." She leaned her head back against the chair. "He is not stupid, though. I could tell that much from the way he looked at me when I answered him. He was not expecting the answer." Newton said Merriweather in a contemplative sort of tone, which was something he did occasionally. The word worn smooth by 23 years of her father saying it the same way. Not as an announcement, just as a fact. The way you might say the name of something you trusted. "Yes," she said, "exactly." She sat in the quiet parlour for a while, listening to the house settle around her and the street outside go gradually still. She thought about the spice route figures and the Derbyshire broker and the lease renewal she had been drafting for a client in Shropshire. She thought briefly and with a curiosity she did not particularly intend about hazel eyes that looked away first. Then she went upstairs to bed. She did not think about the Duke of Westbrook, or not much, which is, as anyone acquainted with the difference will confirm, not quite the same thing. Spring arrived in London in the way it always does, later than anyone hoped, louder than necessary, and with the strong implication that everyone ought to be grateful for it. The parks went green all at once, as if they had been holding the colour in reserve, and had only now been given permission to release it. The morning smelled of wet stone and tulips. Ladies began wearing lighter colours to morning calls, which the gentlemen pretended not to notice, and invariably noticed first. At the enormous desk in the library of Westbrook House, Grosvenor Square, Quentin noticed none of this. He was looking at a set of figures that his steward Henley had placed before him at 9 o'clock that morning, and which he had now been looking at for nearly an hour without them improving. Marcus had been the Westbrook heir for 37 years, and the Westbrook Duke for 3 of them, and in those 3 years had managed to disassemble the financial health of the Westbrook estates with the sort of cheerful thoroughness that requires either tremendous talent or tremendous inattention, and Marcus had possessed both. Shipping ventures that had not shipped. Land speculations that had speculated in entirely the wrong direction. Loans extended to friends who had proven considerably more loyal before repayment had been required. "The situation," said Henley, sitting very straight in the chair across the desk, "is not, strictly speaking, catastrophic." Quentin looked at him over the figures. It is, Henley amended carefully, in the vicinity of catastrophic, close enough to nod at in passing, should catastrophe happen to be moving in the same direction. Henley. Yes, Your Grace. The number. Henley gave him the number. Quentin sat with it for a time. He was a man who had been trained thoroughly and from an early age to maintain composure when composure was inconvenient, and he maintained it now, though the particular muscles involved were working harder than usual. He looked at the surface of the library desk, which had belonged to his grandfather and his grandfather's father before that, and was built of oak that had been old when the family was young, and he thought about the house in Kent, the lawns, the lake, the pale stone facade, and about the 800 and some people whose daily lives were threaded through the health of the Westbrook estates, and about what it would mean if that health continued to deteriorate. "What do you suggest?" he said. Henley produced a list. He had, with characteristic thoroughness, compiled names, financial advisors with strong reputations, conservative practices, genuinely excellent records. He had ranked them. At the top of the list, underlined twice with a small asterisk beside it, were the words Merriweather and Sons. "Extraordinary track record," Henley said. "Several clients who have been with the firm since the previous generation. Consistent, conservative, patient. If anyone can stabilize the Westbrook accounts without requiring a sale of property, it is Merriweather." Quentin looked at the name. B. Merriweather. It sounded capable. It sounded like someone who knew what to do with numbers that currently had too many digits in the wrong columns. "Draft me a letter," he said. He thought for a moment of the dinner at Whitmore House. A woman with amber eyes and a very composed expression, making a very composed reply to something he had said that had been, in retrospect, not his finest contribution to the evening. Merriweather. It was not an unusual name. He thought nothing further of it. He signed the letter the following morning, addressed it to Mr. B. Merriweather, Threadneedle Street, and sent it by messenger before he had done anything else. It was the most useful thing he would do all week. The letter arrived on Thursday, which was Beatrix's morning for correspondence, and she read it twice at her desk on Threadneedle Street, while Newton observed from his portable perch in the corner and ate grapes with the focused serenity of a creature, entirely unbothered by the weight of financial crisis in the air. The letter was, she thought, interesting. Not for its content. The content was what she had expected from what she knew of the Westbrook family's recent history, but for its tone. He had written about the debts plainly. No euphemism, no attempt to reframe catastrophe as a minor complication requiring slight adjustment. He had itemized the problem and asked for help, and signed his name at the bottom without adding anything to the signature that wasn't necessary. She had read a great many letters from clients in financial difficulty. Most of them spent considerable energy on the word "unfortunately." He had not used it once. "The Duke of Westbrook," she said aloud, looking at the signature, "has written to request the services of B. Merriweather and Sons." "Brilliant," said Newton. "He has addressed it to Mr. B. Merriweather." Newton ate another grape, unhurried. "He does not know it is me." She set the letter down and turned it this way and that in her mind. It was not technically a problem. She had conducted entire client relationships through correspondence, and a male associate who attended the meetings in her name, who was very competent and had an excellent handshake and the kind of plain, forgettable face that clients trusted instinctively, and who was entirely willing to accept instruction by letter and relay her decisions as his own. The Duke would never need to know. It was perfectly practical. It was, in fact, the correct thing to do, or she could meet him. She turned the letter over once more. She thought about the dining room at Whitmore House in March. The warmth of it, the particular smell of wax candles and someone's rather ambitious perfume, the silver catching the light at the center of the table, and the faces arranged along it with the expressions that faces arrange themselves into at dinner parties, which is to say the expressions of people determined to find everything they encounter mildly charming. The way he had said it, pleasantly, easily, without malice precisely, just with the uncomplicated certainty of a man who has never had to wonder if the room is listening to him. "Shouldn't you be thinking about cooking rather than trading?" And the way he had looked at her when she answered. That small, quick thing behind his eyes, surprise and something adjacent to reassessment, which was either the beginning of a lesson or the end of one, and she had not at the time been certain which. Newton said, "Buy low," in a decisive way that suggested he had been waiting for the right moment to contribute. "That is not applicable here," Beatrix told him. "Buy low," Newton repeated, utterly serene. She took out paper. She wrote the letter herself, and she introduced herself as Miss Beatrix Merriweather, managing director of Merriweather and Sons since her father's death in January. She did not soften this or apologize for it or present it as an unusual circumstance requiring the reader's understanding, because she had learned very early that apologizing for what you are is a remarkably efficient method of encouraging other people to agree that you should. She named her terms, a meeting, her offices, Tuesday at 10, and she signed with the small precise signature her father had told her to develop, because men with small signatures were taken seriously and women with large ones were not. And if she had to adapt a single thing to the shape of the world she found herself in, the signature was the thing she minded least. She sealed the letter. She gave Newton a third grape, which he received as his natural due. Then she went back to the Shropshire lease renewal, and did not think about hazel eyes or excellent posture for the rest of the morning. Nearly. The offices of Merriweather and Sons occupied the first floor of a building on Threadneedle Street, above a solicitor who kept extremely precise hours, and below a cartographer who did not. The rooms were not large, but they were ordered. Shelves of ledgers along two walls, a wide desk positioned to catch the north light from the window, a good wool carpet in dark green that had belonged to her father, a brass stand in the corner for Newton. There was a particular smell to the place, old paper and linseed oil, and faintly the dried lavender she kept in the drawer because her father had always said that the room in which you conducted business should smell as though someone intended to be there. Beatrix was at her desk when she heard the footsteps on the stair. She did not look up immediately. This was a habit she had developed for precisely this type of meeting. The first impression a client formed was of a woman absorbed in her work, not a woman waiting to be evaluated. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up then. He had, she noted with the analytical attention she gave to most things, the quality of a man who recovers quickly. The pause at the door lasted perhaps 2 full seconds, long enough to take in the room, the ledgers, the desk, the parrot, and then he crossed the threshold and walked to the chair she gestured toward, and sat in it, without making any of the comments that most men made at this juncture. "Good morning, sir," said Newton. Quentin Westbrook looked at Newton. Newton looked back with the specific expression of a creature who had been in this room for considerably longer than any of the visitors, and intended for this to be clear. "He has a very limited repertoire," Beatrix said, "but considerable commitment to it. He's very large. African grey, 23 years old, my father's bird. He says 4 things with regularity and a 5th occasionally, and he has never once been wrong about the weather." Quentin transferred his attention from Newton back to her, and she watched him adjust, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the quiet recalibration of a man who had understood that he was in a different kind of meeting than the one he had anticipated. He opened the folder he had brought, which she had requested in advance, and which contained exactly the figures she had asked for, and he placed it on the desk between them. "Your letter," he said, "was direct." "So was yours," she said. "I appreciated it. Most clients in your position spend the first 3 pages explaining why the situation is not quite what it is." Something, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, moved across his face. "I spent a week drafting it. The first version had considerably more unfortunatelies, and you took them out." Henley pointed out that they were not adding information. "Your steward is sensible." She opened the folder and began reviewing the figures she had already read twice. "Let us see what the situation actually is." What the situation actually was took the better part of an hour to establish with precision, and it was, as she had begun to suspect from his letter, not catastrophic, but in serious need of attention of the kind it had not been receiving. There were assets in the wrong positions. There were investments returning a fraction of what they should. There was a parcel of Derbyshire land that had been sitting unproductive for 3 years, and which could, with the correct lease arrangement and a modest drainage repair, be generating meaningful income within a single season. She spoke. He listened. He did not interrupt, which placed him in a notable minority of the men she worked with. He made notes in a hand that was as clear as his letter had been. When she identified an error in his steward's assessment of the Kent rental income, the kind of error that results from copying a figure from the wrong column, he found the correct column, confirmed the discrepancy, and moved on. Newton said buy low at 10:43 during a discussion of the shipping investment, which was not strictly relevant but conveyed the correct sentiment. By the end of the hour, she had a clear picture of the problem and the broad outline of a strategy, and he had 4 pages of notes and an expression she was beginning to catalogue as his concentrating face, which was quite different from his dining room at Whitmore House face. He sat back. "You know," he said in a tone that was careful without being precious, "we have met before." "We have." "At Whitmore House, in March." He looked at his notes, then at her. "I said something at that dinner that was rather stupid." "You did." "I should like to apologize for it." "That is not necessary," Beatrix said. "It is, actually," he said, which she had not expected. "Not for your sake, you were clearly not damaged by it, but I find that I dislike having said it, and the only treatment for that is to say so." She looked at him for a moment. Newton, from the corner, said Merriweather in the soft, definitive way he reserved for things he had already made up his mind about. "Then I accept it," she said. "And now there is the matter of the Derbyshire land." He accepted the redirection without comment, which she found she liked quite well. The meeting concluded. He stood, gathered his folder, put on his hat. At the door he paused. "Miss Merriweather," he said, "the line about the roast at Whitmore House." A pause. "I have thought about it several times since March. I hope the conclusion was instructive." It was. He looked at her with those hazel eyes, and she noted for the second time that they held light very well, warm, specific, the kind of eyes that, if you were not careful, were extremely easy to keep looking at. "Thursday at 10? "Thursday at 10, she agreed. "Bring the Kent surveys, and the home farm records from the last 3 years if Henley can locate them." "He can locate anything. He kept Marcus's accounts in reasonable order for 2 years, which is the most extraordinary feat of administrative patience I have ever witnessed. Then he will locate the records." She looked at him steadily. "Thursday." He nodded. He went down the stairs. She listened to his footsteps cross the floor below, unhurried and even, and then the street door close, and then the particular quality of quiet that a room has when a presence has just left it, and the air is taking a moment to settle back into itself. Newton said, "Brilliant." "Yes," said Beatrix, "he is beginning to understand that, which is, in its way, rather more interesting than if he had understood it from the start." The Thursday meetings became, by the end of May, a regular feature of the week. Quentin arrived at 10 with increasing punctuality and decreasing formality, not of the kind that suggested carelessness, but the kind that meant he had stopped spending energy on composure and was directing it elsewhere. He learned the names of the regular staff. He stopped explaining his questions before asking them, because he had established that she would simply answer them. He brought better questions each week. Newton, for his part, had begun preening elaborately at approximately 9:30 on Thursdays, which Beatrix interpreted as his version of straightening the room. The Kent accounts were a revelation of the instructive rather than the alarming variety. She went through them line by line across 3 sessions and found, progressively, what she had suspected. Not corruption or dramatic error, but decades of inertia. Things done the way they had always been done, which was to say badly and without examination, which had once been merely inefficient and had now, under the pressure of Marcus's debts, become something closer to dangerous. "Your home farm arrangement," she said on a Wednesday afternoon, when he had come in without an appointment, because he had been passing, and had a question that was apparently urgent enough to justify the deviation from schedule, "is 30 years out of date. The structure benefits the tenant at an arrangement that was reasonable in 1785 and is not reasonable now." He was sitting not in the chair across the desk, but in the one beside it, which had happened gradually over the course of their Thursdays. He had begun leaning to look at the page she was annotating, and eventually the chair had migrated, and now they worked side by side over the maps and ledgers, which was more efficient and which neither of them mentioned. "How would you restructure it?" he said. She showed him. The acreage figures, the yield projections, the comparable arrangements she had set up for 2 other clients with similar land compositions in Kent. He followed the logic with the concentration she had come to associate with his better moments, quiet, specific, tracking her reasoning rather than waiting for a conclusion. "It would take a season to show results," she said, "and the drainage repair. Non-negotiable. The East Field is losing 15% of its productivity to standing water. The repair will cost £60 and return that in the first yield." He wrote this down. The afternoon light had shifted. The room smelled of the wax she used on the desk, and the faint green smell that came through the window from the courtyard below when the wind came from the east. Outside, somewhere on the street, a horse objected to something with considerable feeling. "The Derbyshire property," he said without looking up from his notes. "You said it could be made productive within a season. Do you genuinely believe that?" "I said 18 months, which is not a season." "You said within a season of beginning the correct lease arrangement." "That is different from within a season. The lease arrangement is the first step. The productivity follows it." He looked up from his notes. His hazel eyes had that quality she had catalogued, the one where he was working something out, not challenging but genuinely following a thread to its end. "I would like to see the Derbyshire property," he said, "and the Kent estate in person. You told me yourself that land cannot be properly understood from correspondence." "I told you that figures could not be fully trusted without seeing what they represent." "The same principle." He set down his pen. "Would you come to Westbrook Hall for the Kent review, the home farm questions, the tenant contracts, the drainage survey? I have been trying to understand the East Field from a map for 6 weeks, and I am quite certain I am reading the wrong contour lines." She considered it. She had visited client properties before. Her father had always said that you could not manage land from a desk any more than you could sail a ship from a library. "When?" "July, before the harvest arrangements need to be finalized. I can give you 4 days. That would be sufficient, and—" He hesitated, which was unusual. "Does Newton travel?" She looked at the parrot in question. Newton looked back with the inscrutable composure of a creature who had made all his significant decisions and was merely observing the humans catching up. "He does," she said. "He is better company on a long journey than most people." "Then bring him," Quentin said. "The hall has survived a good deal of eccentricity. It can survive a parrot." "That is a generous assessment of Newton," Beatrix said. "He finds it more complicated than that." Newton said nothing, which, she had learned, was his way of indicating that he agreed with her characterization completely. Kent in the height of summer smelled of cut grass and warm earth, and something else quieter, the particular sweetness that the air holds when it has been carrying pollen long enough to become part of the weather. Beatrix arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of July, in a carriage that had taken 4 hours from London, and had been occupied for most of them by Newton, who had surveyed the passing countryside through the small ventilated opening in his travelling case with the expression of a cartographer, confirming a route he had already memorized. Westbrook Hall sat in its landscape, the way certain houses do when they have been there long enough to believe they belong to the land, rather than to any family. Pale limestone, 3 stories, a broad south face that caught the morning sun and gave it back slowly. The lawns went down in tiers to a lake that caught the light and held it past the hour it should have gone. Everything was well tended, which told her something important about the steward. Henley kept the aesthetics immaculate even while the accounts bled. The estate office was the most honest room in the house. The ledgers stacked on the shelves were old, and their spines were softened with handling. And the smell of the room was brass polish and damp wool and ink, which was the smell of things being attended to, which she found more reassuring than any assurance could be. She spent the first morning in that room, going through the actual ledgers rather than the copies that had been sent to London, and found what she had expected to find: more precision in the originals, more margin notes, more of the daily texture of a working estate that the fair copies inevitably ironed out. Newton was installed in the small morning room by the garden, where the light was good, and there was a window he could observe from. The housekeeper, Mrs. Quill, had greeted his arrival with the particular expression of a woman who has managed eccentricity for 30 years and considers it simply another entry in the household accounts. "He says good morning," Beatrix had told her. "I shall say good morning back," Mrs. Quill had replied without batting an eye, which Beatrix found entirely reasonable. Quentin walked the grounds with her on the Tuesday afternoon, and this was where she understood the estate in a way she could not have from any document. He knew the names of the tenants in each farm, not as entries on a list, but as people with children and histories and the particular quality of their handshakes at the quarter day. He knew where the east field drained badly from the way the grass grew darker in a line across the bottom third of it. He knew which of the old apple trees were still bearing and which had given up quietly around 1810 and simply not been replaced. She walked with him along the edge of the problematic field, the sun at their backs and the grass making the sound that long grass makes in a warm wind, a continuous, low rushing, like something breathing slowly. "There," she said, pointing to the dark stripe along the lower boundary, "that is your 15%. He looked. "I thought it was the soil." "It is the soil, but the soil is wet because the field is collecting drainage from the rise above it, and the original drainage channel, and here," she pointed to a slight depression in the ground, "was built before that boundary wall went in, which diverted it." She looked at the rise, the wall, the dark stripe of grass. £60 and 3 weeks' work. My steward estimated 80. Your steward was estimating the original channel width. You only need to redirect, not replace. He wrote something in the small book he had taken to carrying. She had noticed him developing this habit over the course of their Thursdays. He had begun the meetings taking notes on his documents, and sometime in May had started carrying his own notebook instead, which she found, for reasons she did not closely examine, rather endearing. They worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, going through the tenant surveys in the library with the south windows open and the smell of the gardens coming in, lavender and cut grass, and faintly, from somewhere, the warm, yeasty suggestion of the home bakehouse. The maps were spread across the table between them, and they stood over them the way you stand over maps when the work is going well, shoulder close to shoulder, pointing at the same thing from two slightly different angles. Newton, from the morning room across the hall, said, "Buy low," in a carrying voice. Quentin looked toward the sound. "Does he do that when you're working at the office?" "Constantly. I have come to regard it as editorial commentary." "Is it generally accurate?" She considered. "More often than not." She looked back at the map. "The home farm boundary, here, needs to come with the new lease. The current arrangement gives the tenant this acreage." She traced it, "at terms that are 30 years out of date. What I would propose is this." She outlined it, the restructured lease, the new acreage division, the adjusted terms that would benefit both the estate and a modernized tenancy. He followed the argument, asked 3 specific questions, and then stood back and looked at the map with the expression that she had come to think of as his processing face, which required a slightly longer interval of silence than his other expressions. Outside, the light had turned the particular gold of a July evening that is trying to last. "You are very certain of this," he said finally. "I am certain of the figures. The rest is application." "You sound like your father." She looked at him. "You have mentioned him several times," he said quietly. "The way you describe the work, the patience of it, the particular kind of attention. He taught you all of this. From 11 onward." She folded her hands on the edge of the map. "He said the most important quality in finance is not intelligence. It is the willingness to look at something until you see it accurately, even if what you see is inconvenient." She paused. He applied the same principle to people. Quentin was looking at her. The evening light came in at a low angle and caught the hazel of his eyes and held it, so that for a moment they were very gold. "He sounds," he said, "like someone I would have found extremely challenging." "He would have argued with you," Beatrix said. "He argued with everyone whose opinion he respected. He found agreement suspicious." "Did he argue with you?" "Constantly, until I started winning, and then he began sending for tea and changing the subject, which was how I knew I'd got it." Quentin laughed. "The real kind," Not the careful social version, but the unguarded sort, the one that meant it, arriving all at once without preamble. It was the kind of laugh that changed a face, and his changed considerably for the better. She looked back at the map. His hand, resting on the table beside the survey, was very close to hers. Neither of them moved. Newton said from the morning room, "Brilliant." The word arrived into the quiet of the library like a small stone dropped into still water, and the ripples of it went out to the edges of the room. Beatrix said, "He means the drainage solution." "Of course," said Quentin. His voice was quite steady, which was, she thought, rather more effort than it looked. "The Derbyshire survey," she said. "Yes." He reached for his notebook. The Derbyshire survey. They worked for another hour. It was extremely productive. August was when things became complicated, which was, in Beatrix's experience, the month August reliably chose for this purpose. It waited until the heat had made everyone slightly less careful, and then it arranged things. The complexity was not financial. The financial situation was in fact going quite well, better than she had projected, which was a thing she found more satisfying than almost anything else she could name, and which she allowed herself to feel with some thoroughness on the evening the first August reports came in. The Kent Home Farm restructuring was underway. The Derbyshire lease arrangements had been sent to Henley with detailed instructions, and Henley, who had turned out to be a man of considerable capability, who had simply been waiting for someone to tell him what to do, was implementing them with methodical efficiency and a growing frequency of letters that suggested he had, somewhere in the process, stopped thinking of her as an unusual circumstance and started thinking of her as a resource. The drainage repair had begun in the first week of August and was proceeding on schedule. She received reports twice a week. They were, consistently, exactly what she had hoped. The complexity was the letters that were not from Henley. She corresponded with most of her clients by post, which was efficient and professional and exactly appropriate to a business relationship conducted between a managing director and the person whose accounts she managed. Client letters arrived with information and left with instructions, and the whole arrangement was entirely sensible. Quentin Westbrook's letters were also sensible. They contained accurate information, relevant questions, and occasional observations that she found herself reading twice. He described the state of the lake in the morning, which had nothing to do with the accounts. He mentioned a conversation with the head gardener about whether the apple harvest would be early, which was relevant to exactly no financial matter she could identify. He wrote a full paragraph about a ewe who had escaped her field and been located in the kitchen garden, sitting composedly beside the herb bed with the expression of a creature who had made a considered decision and was prepared to stand by it. She wrote back about the accounts. She also, she noticed, wrote back about the ewe, and she noted that her replies, which had begun at the appropriate length for professional correspondence, were gradually becoming longer, which she categorized as a development and declined to examine too closely. Newton noticed. This was the problem with a parrot of 23 years' experience. He had accumulated enough data to draw conclusions. "Merriweather," Newton said one evening, in the tone he used when he thought she was being slow. "I am reading correspondence." "Merriweather," Newton said again. "Yes, I am aware," she said, which was not what she had meant to say. She set the letter down. Outside, August rain was doing what August rain does in London, coming down in the decisive way that suggests it has made up its mind and has no interest in negotiation. The parlour smelled of damp wool from the umbrella in the stand, and the particular sweetness of the almond biscuits she had brought from the kitchen because it was 8:30 and she was still working, which was a habit that Newton regarded with weary familiarity. The September projections for the Derbyshire property came in the following week, ahead of estimate. Not by a little, by a margin that made her sit with the page for a moment before reading it again, the satisfaction of it moving through her the way the best results always did. Not with excitement, but with something quieter and more permanent, the specific pleasure of having been right about something that mattered. She picked up her pen. She wanted to tell someone, a specific someone. She was clear enough with herself to acknowledge that. She put the pen down. Newton looked at her with one bright eye. "Oh, for heaven's sake," he said. Beatrix stared at him. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Newton repeated. entirely composed in the voice of a creature who had had this opinion for some time and had merely been waiting for the appropriate moment to table it. She sat in the parlour for a moment longer, listening to the rain, and to Newton breathing in the small measured way he breathed when he was pretending to be asleep and was not. Then she picked up her pen and wrote the letter. It included the Derbyshire figures in full and the projected autumn timeline and a concise note about the timing of the planting decisions, all of which was entirely professional. And at the end, she added 3 sentences about an article she had encountered in the Times on the subject of animal behaviour as estate commentary, which was not professional at all and which she included anyway, which was, she acknowledged to herself, a decision. She folded the letter, sealed it, addressed it to Westbrook Hall in Kent and put it on the pile for the Morning Post before she could change her mind. His reply arrived in 4 days. The notes on the Derbyshire timeline were thorough and accurate. The paragraph at the end was considerably longer than 3 sentences, and it contained a remark about the ewe in question, now apparently a recurring character in the kitchen garden, who had developed a preference for the rosemary, that made Beatrix laugh alone in her parlour on a Thursday evening, which was not the most dignified thing she had ever done, and which she found she did not particularly mind. The leaves had turned. This was London's one reliable gesture toward beauty, the parks going amber and copper, and the particular deep gold that a city earns by having spent the year being mostly grey. And Beatrix was at her desk reviewing the final quarterly projections when the bell rang at the front door. She was not expecting anyone. She heard the maid open the door, and then a low voice, and then footsteps on the stair, and then he was at the door of her office, and she understood immediately from the quality of his expression that this was not a professional visit. He was not in his usual calling clothes. He was in the coat he wore when he was being less careful about what he wore, which was the dark navy one that sat better than the formal ones, and he was carrying his hat in his hands rather than wearing it, and his expression was the most unguarded she had seen it, less composed than usual, more present. "Miss Merriweather," he said. "Your Grace." She set down her pen. "I was not expecting you." "I was not entirely expecting myself." He looked at the room, the ledgers, the maps, Newton on his stand surveying the newcomer with the neutral attention of a creature who reserves judgment, and then back at her. "I was at a dinner last evening, Lord Hargreaves. Several men from the Exchange were there. Newton said, 'Good morning, sir,' which was, given the hour, inaccurate, but Quentin looked at him and said, 'Good afternoon, Newton,' with a composure that the parrot acknowledged by remaining still, which was his version of approval. The conversation, Quentin continued, looking back at her, turned to Merriweather and Sons, to the performance of several accounts managed out of Threadneedle Street this year, the Derbyshire yields, the Kent Farm restructuring. A pause. The remarkable returns on 3 clients who had come to the firm in the last 12 months. "I see," said Beatrix. "Lord Hargreaves said he had met the firm's managing director last spring and had found her. He did not use that word, he said the advisor. The most rigorous financial mind he had encountered in 3 decades. He stopped. I knew who he meant. And what was said? He looked at her very directly. 2 men at the table, men I have known well for 15 years, made comments about the novelty of it, about how amusing it was that such results were being produced by... He stopped. Something in his jaw set briefly. "I told them," he said in a quieter voice, "that I had worked with B. Merriweather for 6 months, and that the Westbrook accounts had returned 14% above projection in that period, and that if they found competence amusing, they were welcome to employ it themselves and see how funny it looked from that direction." The room was very quiet. He had come to her. He had stood up for her at Lord Hargreaves' table, in front of men he had known for 15 years. She absorbed this and held it and set it alongside the other things she had been quietly accumulating since April. "I should also like to say," he continued, turning the hat in his hands once, "that I have thought a great deal about Whitmore House. You apologized at our first meeting. I did, and I meant it. But there is more I want to say." He looked at her steadily. "I said that stupid thing in March because I was the sort of man at that point who did not think to look, who assumed that the room already contained all the information worth having. He stopped. I am trying with varying success to be less that sort of man. Newton said, brilliant, with the soft, decisive conviction that he reserved for things he had already concluded. He agrees with you, Beatrix said. He is a very perceptive bird. Quentin looked at Newton, then back at her. The accounts are in order, he said. The estates are stable. In the spring, the Derbyshire properties will return to full productivity, and the Kent arrangement will be into its second season. You have done what I could not do alone, and I am grateful for it, beyond my ability to say it correctly. He took a breath. But I find, Miss Merriweather, that what I am most grateful for has very little to do with the accounts. Outside, October was doing its best with the afternoon light, stretching the gold of it along the rooftops and across the window glass. The parlour was warm and smelled of old paper and the faint sweetness of the almond biscuits from the kitchen below. Beatrix looked at him for a long moment. When you wrote to me in April, she said, I had a choice. I could have conducted the entire arrangement through correspondence, through my associate Mr. Fenn, and you would never have known it was me. Why didn't you? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because you had been rude to me, she said, and I wanted to see you understand that in person rather than by letter. A pause, and because I was curious about what kind of man takes the unfortunatelys out of his own letter. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Surprise, and then something warmer, and then the kind of expression that arrives when a person finds they like the answer they have been given more than they expected. And what did you conclude? That he was a better kind than the one at the dinner table, she said, which I suppose is the point of dinner tables, to make people worse than they actually are, so that there is somewhere to improve from. He laughed, and it was the real laugh, the good one, the one that arrived without announcement and made the room feel smaller and more alive. Beatrix, he said, and her name in his voice had the quality of something he had been careful with, deliberate and certain, the way you say the name of something you have thought about for a long time. Quentin, she said, which was not what she had said aloud to him before, and which felt on the first use exactly as precise as the small signature on her professional letters. He looked at her. The hat was still in his hands. The afternoon light was very gold. I should like, he said, to call on you. Not professionally, or not only professionally. I recognize that is two somewhat different things, and that you may have an entirely reasonable set of objections to the combination, and I should like very much to hear them if you do. One condition, Beatrix said, whatever you require. You will never suggest to me that I ought to be thinking about cooking. He looked at her for a moment with those hazel eyes warm and wholly present. I will never suggest to you anything I have not first verified to my complete satisfaction is correct, he said. That, she said, is the most intelligent thing you have said since March. I have been working on the average. I can see that. She looked at him. This man who had mocked her in March and listened in April and laughed in July and stood up for her in October without being asked to, and she found herself thinking that her father had been right about a great many things, including the part about sentiment being the best reason for any decision, which he had said quietly and which had always been true. There is coffee, she said, and I believe I have the spring projections nearly finished, and you have, against most reasonable expectations, developed a genuinely useful understanding of the Derbyshire situation, and I should quite like your opinion on the spring planting arrangement. Lead the way, he said. Newton, she said, without looking away from Quentin. What do you think? Newton turned on his perch. He regarded them both with his bright, small, entirely informed eyes. Brilliant, he said. The afternoon light held on in the parlour, golden and unhurried, in the way that October afternoons hold on when they have found something worth staying for.